Does anyone have to understand absolutely everything today? Our topic today is language. Language not only for leadership. Many people who listen to this podcast are either in a leadership position or you work in an organization where communication is extremely important, or you're a trainer, speaker, coach, consultant about exactly that area, which means you have to speak every day. Probably even you make your living with your voice. So what do I mean with does everyone have to understand everything today? We have a tendency that people say you have to give information to absolutely everyone in a way that they understand it. And there's a huge culture difference between the German language, and you probably have heard about the fascinating long German words. German is quite keen, especially the German language is quite keen to put expert words in a very complicated way into documents. But that's not the topic today. The topic today is about what about plain language? And by the way, there's a massive difference between plain language and easy language. Because easy language, there's an approach in inclusion to write scripts and text in a way that, for example, people with handicaps are able to read it, or people who have certain learning disabilities that they are able to learn it. That's not the topic today, because inclusion is important. It's proven by science that being part of society and inclusion only works when you have access to information. When you are left behind, it simply means nothing else that you stop to believe in society and you stop to believe whatever people tell you. But what are certain traits of plain language, especially important in the leadership area, or when you communicate with colleagues, maybe the strategic, tactical, or operative level? Maybe you have to talk to suppliers or anyone basically who has to do with you on a job level or even in private life. There are certain traits of plain language. So first, you choose words which you rather speak rather than write down. Of course, I could say when, for example, I hear far right-wing slurs, I could say here, well, the only thing I feel is floxinoxinohillophilippication. So that's always a word you can show off with, especially as a non-native speaker. Look it up. It's nothing else than you feel in a certain way about people who did that to you, people who said that. And it's not a positive way. Just look it up. It's a very British word. It was only ever said once in the House of Commons by Jacob Rees-Mogg, the Speaker of the House at the moment. He used floxinoxinohillophilippication in one of his speeches against the European Union. But you would not use these kind of words because it's a bit posh, and also you normally confuse and lose people. It also means that when you want to use plain language, you use the active rather than the passive choice of words. You have very simple and plain languages. You have very short sentences, and also you do not jump in your thoughts, which sometimes makes it very complicated, especially when you want to express different legal thoughts, which are quite complicated. And also, and here's the first point where I really start to think, do we need that? 10 to 11 words is the average length of a phrase. I mean, if you just have a minute left or 2 or 3, just restart this podcast and try to set a full stop every 10 or even 11 words. And even the phrase I just used and use now is longer than 10 or 11 words. So there's only 1/3 per phrase. That's the recommendation. And you should use different words. And I had a couple of examples which I read and really thought, is that helpful to use that kind of language? So for example, you should use money instead of means of payment. Or you should use church instead of house of God or house of worship. And you should use, and that was the one where people really lost me, you should use rank instead of hierarchy, because hierarchy is too complicated, obviously, for people today to understand. Look, it is important to give people access to information, but there's a real difference between rank and hierarchy. Rank means we have a very clear-cut rank. It's from A to Z, from 1 to 10. Everyone can understand it. Nice, and people understand everything, but hierarchy has so many social aspects in it that rank and hierarchy simply is not the same. Money and means of payment is a massive difference. Means of payment can mean any kind of payment. Money, most people think of cash, coins and bills, or notes for our British listeners. And house of worship and church is a massive difference as well. House of worship could mean anything which is dedicated to a certain religion or movement where they worship to whatever they believe in, while church is something where people say that is rather either Catholic or Protestant. It's a Christian belief system. No one who is of Muslim faith would say, I go to church, they go to a mosque. And making everything so simple has massive disadvantages. And by the way, and that's also part of the recommendation to use plain language, don't use metaphors, don't use irony, and don't use idioms. Oh, by the way, you shouldn't use the word idiom, you should use the word saying. But there is a difference between an idiom and a saying. An idiom is something which is recognized in the whole society, something that everyone basically knows, just some people don't get the clue of it. A saying can basically be anything which becomes common even in a circle of friends. And also you should abolish any kind of abstract terms and only use specific terms. So you can't say, oh, we have 3 options A, B, C. You should say, oh, we have the option where we do that, we have the option where we do that, and where we have the option where we do that. And very important now, I'm not judging here in the first place. I don't want to sound elitist, although it might come across I sound elitist in that way. That's not my intention. There are 3 main aspects which we have to consider, and these are, number 1, what's your target audience? You have to distinguish between different target audiences. So far, so good. Number 2, what is their level of education? And level of education does not mean formal level of education. When you look into far right-wing parties who just peddle out their xenophobic slurs, oh, by the way, xenophobic again would be a term which you shouldn't use. You should then say people who have problem with anything that is basically strange or unknown to them. So these people are often very well educated. You cannot say that Nigel Farage is stupid or Jacob Rees-Mogg, who's also very conservative, is stupid. They are very well educated. The level of education means, are people able to understand what you're going to say to them? And so number 1 is target audience, number 2 is the level of education, and number 3 is the intention. Sometimes people use very plain words to simply yada 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 over something to make it sound very easy. So for example, when someone says, we have an oven-ready deal, it sounds like the deal is already pretty much signed. When a couple of months or weeks later, you suddenly realize, oh, it wasn't that oven-ready, that simply means someone just tricked you into believing them. So first thing you have to recognize is, what is your target audience? What's the level of education, which is more the social level of education, how much they're able to understand what you say and how you say it, and then what is your intention? What also is very important is, expertise includes expert words. So expertise, when you really want to get to the point, I'm now going to go with of course we could now talk about dentists or engineers, but the best example is lawyers. And I know some people emailed me after the last podcast episode and said, why do you use lawyers as an example? I don't like lawyers, blah, blah, blah. Yes, I know that let's say, social appreciation of lawyers is debatable. But if you like it or not, and my father's a former public prosecutor, he doesn't like lawyers as well, but still he admits that when you speak in legal terms, your thinking must be dead sharp and absolutely brilliant, because you have to write something down, which at the end you send to the court, you send to the judge, you send to anyone and absolutely everyone who has anything to do with that lawsuit, and every tiny bit which might be wrong will be attacked. And in hardly any other job, you must be that smart. And in hardly any other job, you hardly ever have a second chance. Because as soon as you wrote it down and you send it somewhere, it's out there. You can't say, oh, I haven't written that. You have. In most jobs, you can correct it afterwards. In legal terms, you often can't, because they say, that is the statement you made, and we're going to attack it from there. So expert knowledge includes expert words. So second is the reduction of complexity is good, but third, the oversimplification of something does not lead to any kind of expertise. And this is where it becomes complicated. And again, people say, isn't leadership quite simple? No, it's not. When you have all these books, especially when books say 7 steps to blah, 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 or people say the only leadership book you ever have to read in your life, these are always books that give you a rough idea of a couple of concepts. It is never the only book. And when you have these kind of claims on a book title, the only aim is that they take the money off you, they give you a couple of ideas. Thank you very much for the revenue and the profit for the person who wrote the book and for the publisher who brought it to the market. Your life will not be much better. That's why scientific books never have these kind of titles, because any scientist knows I'm looking at a certain aspect of leadership right now, but I know that many aspects are not covered by what I'm talking here. So very important now is, so back to these 3 points. Number 1, expertise always means expert words. Step number 2, reduction of complexity is good to explain something, but oversimplification of something is not good because it doesn't give you the whole idea. I'll just give you an example. You may have heard about different apps which tell you the content of a whole book on just one page. One page, and then they tell you, oh, if you use this app for a tenner a month, you can read 4 books a day. It reminds me a bit of Woody Allen. Woody Allen once said, I did a speed reading class. I now can read War and Peace in 2 hours, and I did. It's about Russia. And that's exactly where you are. You just get superficial knowledge to be a bit more smart than others about it, but you don't really have the expertise. You can't stop reading books. First, when you read books, you really get an in-depth insight when it's a really good book. Putting a whole book on one page never leads to the same result, and that is blindingly obvious to anyone who ever read a book, and unfortunately, many haven't. So, what is the result of all this? Not everyone has to understand absolutely anything. That is result number 1. Result number 2, still every target audience within your organization has the right and must have access to information, which means you, for example, have to communicate via different people. So, for example, the CEO does a speech to senior management, senior leadership. Senior leadership speaks to the tactical level. For example, people who lead departments. Department leaders then speak to team leaders. Team leaders then, on operational level, speak to their staff, etc., etc. Each and every one of them must be professionally trained how to communicate knowledge to different target audiences. And that's what makes leadership so complicated and complex. That's also why we talk about situative leadership. A situative approach to leadership is the only one that works. There is no checklist where you say step 1, step 2, step 3, and that always works, which is the reason why these 8 steps to 9 steps to 12, all these books aren't worth the paper they are printed on, because they are basically coming from the self-help industry and they oversimplify. Maybe you heard about the Simplify books, a couple of good ideas, but normally they don't cover the whole concept. So, in results, step number 1, not everyone has to understand absolutely everything. But step number 2, you must give them access to the information in the way they understand it. So you must be able to have properly trained staff on different levels of the hierarchy, not the ranks, the hierarchy in your organization. And step number 3, and that is the third result we have here, expertise is the foundation of excellent results. Mediocrity is not. The people who go for mediocrity are not the ones who set the bar for quality. And that is a very important statement. You will only thrive with your organization when you go for expertise level. And during the COVID-19 crisis, you have seen that even more. If you don't offer real expertise, there's nothing left that people will buy from you. When you have just a bland statement to offer, when you only have knowledge which is pretty mediocre, but people can also Google it, have the same effect, only expertise will lead to excellent results. So, take it together. 3 things you have to take care of. Number 1, target audience. Number 2, level of education. Number 3, your intention. What's important now, expertise contains expert words. That is very important. The reduction of complexity is good. That's step number 2 of what's important. But step number 3, the oversimplification of any kind of knowledge is not good, because you don't get to the point which is really the matter. And the result, 3 main results. Number 1, not everyone has to understand absolutely everything, but number 2, you must be able to communicate the knowledge, the content to everyone in the organization, but you can speak with different people and they can then speak to their people. You just have to professionally train them to do so. And step number 3, expertise stays and always will be the foundation for excellent results. Mediocrity does not set the bar, the goal, and the quality level. I wish you all the best implementing that in your organization. And for today, thank you very much for your time.